The town square of Cedarfield buzzed with energy. Flags waved, cameras rolled, and families filled the open space to hear President Donald Trump speak during his visit to the rural community. Farmers, veterans, teachers, and children gathered, hoping to catch a glimpse of the president. Among them stood Jacob Miller, a 52-year-old farmer whose weathered hands told the story of decades working the land. He wore a faded plaid shirt and a straw hat, but his eyes held a storm, an unspoken burden. Trump's motorcade arrived and cheers erupted. The stage was decorated with banners about supporting American workers and strengthening rural communities. Yet, Jacob wasn't there for the usual applause. He clutched a folded letter in his pocket, his heart pounding. He whispered to himself, "This isn't about me. It's about them." As Trump took the podium, thanking farmers for feeding the nation, Jacob's chest tightened. The words were kind, but Jacob knew that behind his calm demeanor lay a truth that needed to be told. The crowd listened with excitement, but Jacob's mind replayed sleepless nights, unpaid bills, and a heartbreaking loss that had changed his family forever. When Trump began to talk about resilience of American farmers, Jacob's hands trembled. Something inside him snapped. An urgency stronger than fear. He stepped forward. "Mr. President." Jacob's voice rang out above the crowd. Gasps rippled through the audience as heads turned. Security tensed immediately, moving toward him, but Jacob lifted both hands high, showing he had nothing but a letter. His voice cracked as he shouted again, "Please just hear me out." Trump paused mid-sentence. The crowd fell silent. Even the air seemed to hold its breath. Jacob's wife, Mary, standing near the back, covered her mouth in fear. She knew her husband had been wrestling with this decision for weeks, torn between staying quiet and speaking the truth. Trump motioned for security to hold back. "Let him speak," he said, surprising everyone. Jacob's knees felt weak. As he stepped closer, he could feel hundreds of eyes burning into him, some angry, others curious. He swallowed hard, pulled the letter from his pocket, and said, "I'm just a farmer, sir. But I need you to know what's happening to people like me. This isn't about politics. It's about survival." Trump studied him, his expression unreadable. Cameras zoomed in, capturing the moment that would soon spread across the world. Jacob's voice shook but grew steadier as he spoke. "I lost something no farmer should ever lose. And if I stay silent, more families will face the same pain." The crowd murmured. No one expected this ordinary farmer to change the course of the event. Jacob looked directly at Trump, then at the crowd. "I was born on my father's farm. It wasn't much, but it was honest work. He used to tell me, 'The land gives back what you give it if you respect it.' I believe that, and I raise my children to believe it, too." He paused, his throat tightening. But farming isn't the same anymore. Costs rise, prices fall, and families like mine are drowning in debt. We work sun up to sundown and still can't keep up. Some farmers in the crowd nodded, their faces mirroring his pain. Jacob's hands shook as he held up the letter. "This is a letter I wrote to you months ago, but I never mailed it. I thought who would listen to me? Just a farmer from Cedarfield. But today I couldn't stay silent." Trump leaned slightly forward, his eyes narrowing with interest. Jacob continued, "This isn't only about crops or money. It's about my son." His name was Daniel. His voice cracked on the name. The crowd hushed, sensing the weight of what was coming. He was 22, strong, full of dreams. He wanted to be the first in our family to graduate college. But the pressure on our farm, the endless debt, it broke him. And 2 years ago, Jacob's voice faltered and tears welled in his eyes. Mary's sob from the back carried into the silence. Jacob whispered, 2 years ago, I lost him to suicide." The crowd froze. The square went completely silent. The sound of a bird overhead felt louder than the hundreds of people standing still. Jacob's shoulders trembled as he tried to hold himself together. "My boy," he hid his pain. "Well," Jacob continued, his voice low but steady. "He didn't want to disappoint us. He thought if he failed to keep the farm alive, he failed his family." Mary clutched her scarf in the crowd, tears streaming down her face. Friends who knew Daniel wiped their eyes. "I buried my son with these hands," Jacob said, holding them up, calloused, rough, stained by years of labor. "And I swore that day I wouldn't let his story end with him. I would tell the world what farmers face because my son wasn't weak. He was crushed under a burden no young man should carry." Some in the crowd began sobbing openly. Trump's jaw tightened, and even the Secret Service agents looked uneasy. Jacob unfolded the letter in his hand, but instead of reading, he pressed it against his chest. "I don't want pity. I want change. I want no father to stand over his son's grave because the land broke him." Trump gripped the podium, visibly moved. He wasn't a man easily shaken, but Jacob's raw honesty pierced through the formal setting. He looked at Jacob and asked quietly, "What do you want from me?" Jacob's answer came quickly, like he'd been holding it in for years. "I want you to listen not to me, but to farmers everywhere. We don't ask for charity. We ask for fairness. We ask for a chance to survive without burying our children under debt." The crowd erupted in applause, many standing in support. The emotions swept like a wave. Trump nodded slowly, then said, "You've spoken with courage, Jacob. More courage than most. I'll listen." But Jacob wasn't done. He took a step closer. "Listening isn't enough, sir. I'm asking you to come see it. Walk my fields, sit at my table, see what's really happening. Not through numbers on a report, but through the eyes of a family fighting to keep their land." The boldness of his request stunned everyone. The president visiting a small farm. It sounded impossible, but Trump didn't dismiss it. He looked Jacob straight in the eye and said, "Maybe I should." The crowd gasped. The moment replayed instantly across cameras. Headlines would later scream, "Farmer challenges Trump during speech receives unexpected answer." But for Jacob, the world shrank to this single moment. He whispered almost in disbelief, "You mean it?" Trump nodded. "Yes, I'll come. If I say I support farmers, then I should stand where they stand." Cheers erupted, but many also stood stunned in silence. Jacob's eyes filled with tears, not of grief this time, but of relief. "Thank you," he whispered, pressing his letter into Trump's hand. Security began moving Jacob back, but Trump raised a hand, signaling them to wait. He shook Jacob's hand firmly, and the gesture sent shockwaves through the crowd. People clapped, some cried, and cameras captured the image that would soon circle the world. The President of the United States shaking hands with a grieving farmer. Mary, watching from the back, felt her knees weaken. For the first time since Daniel's death, she saw hope flicker in her husband's eyes. As Jacob stepped back, the crowd erupted in chants of support. Trump cleared his throat, looked at the crowd, and said, "This man just reminded us all. Behind every number is a name, a family, a story, and we can't forget that." The next morning, Cedarfield was buzzing with talk. Local radio stations replayed the moment endlessly while newspapers printed Jacob's tearful words. Farmers from neighboring towns called to say, "You spoke for all of us?" Mary worried it was all just talk. "What if he forgets?" she asked as they worked in the kitchen. Jacob shook his head. "No, Mary," he looked me in the eye. He meant it. Days later, the White House confirmed it. President Trump would visit the Miller farm. The announcement shocked reporters and thrilled struggling farmers across the Midwest. Jacob's daughter Sarah, who had been quiet since her brother's death, whispered, "Dad, he's really coming here." "Yes," Jacob said softly. "He's coming here." For the first time in years, Jacob's farm bustled with hope. Neighbors pitched in, repairing fences and repainting barns, not for appearances, but because they wanted to show pride in their way of life. Mary, watching it unfold, whispered to herself, "Daniel, you'd never believe this." Yet deep inside, Jacob wrestled with doubt. Would a single visit truly change anything, or was he setting himself up for disappointment again? The day finally came. Secret Service vehicles lined the dirt road leading to Miller Farm. Helicopters hovered overhead and neighbors gathered at a distance, craning their necks to see history unfold in their tiny town. Jacob stood at the gate, hands trembling. Mary squeezed his arm. "Breathe," she whispered. A black SUV pulled up and out stepped Trump, wearing a simple navy suit, no tie. He walked toward Jacob, hand extended. "You kept your word," Jacob said softly. "And so did you," Trump replied. They walked the fields together. Jacob showed him the cracked soil, the broken irrigation lines, the barns patched with whatever scrap they could find. "This land fed my family for generations," Jacob said. "But today, it's barely keeping us alive." Trump listened carefully, asking questions, not as a politician, but as a man trying to understand. Mary served lunch at the farmhouse table, simple stew and cornbread. Trump bowed his head as Jacob prayed for the meal. At one point, Trump looked at a faded photo of Daniel hanging on the wall. He didn't speak, but the silence was heavy. Jacob's eyes filled with tears as he whispered, "That's the boy I lost." Trump placed a hand on Jacob's shoulder. Jacob led Trump deeper into the farm, stopping at a broken tractor sitting idle. "That machine is 20 years old," Jacob explained. "I fix it with whatever scraps I can find because I can't afford new parts. Banks don't lend to men like me anymore." Trump ran his hand along the rusted metal, his expression tight. Jacob continued, "When people in the city see food on their plates, they don't think about the farmer who grew it or what he's going through. They don't see the sleepless nights, the auction notices, the empty chairs at dinner because kids leave for jobs that don't break their backs." Trump looked toward the horizon where the sun painted the fields gold. "You're right," he said quietly. "We talk about numbers, exports, and trade deals, but we forget the people behind it." Jacob swallowed hard. "I lost my boy because of that forgetting." For a moment, the President of the United States said nothing. Then, in a rare softness, he replied, "And I won't forget him." Jacob felt something stir in his chest, a flicker of hope. Word spread quickly through Cedarfield. The president was actually walking through Jacob Miller's farm. Families came from nearby towns, lining the fences just to witness history. Neighbors who once kept to themselves showed up with casseroles and pies, not to impress, but to honor the moment. The small community felt united in a way it hadn't in years. Inside the barn, Trump met with local farmers. Each took turns sharing their struggles: equipment debt, unpredictable markets, and the toll on their families. Some spoke through tears, others through clenched fists. Trump listened, jotting notes, asking questions. The farmers weren't used to being heard. Not like this. Sarah, Jacob's daughter, stood in the back, watching. For the first time since her brother's death, she felt her father's voice mattered. When Trump looked directly at her and asked, "What do you want for your future?" she froze. Her voice cracked as she answered, "I want farms like ours to still exist when I'm older. I don't want my brother's death to mean nothing." The barn fell silent. Trump gave her a firm nod. "Then, that will be our work." As the visit came to a close, Jacob realized he hadn't yet shared the letter he once carried to Trump's speech. With trembling hands, he unfolded the worn paper at the farmhouse table. "This," Jacob said, "is what I wrote the night I lost Daniel." He began to read aloud. The words were raw, filled with grief and desperation. "Mr. President, I don't write as a Republican or Democrat. I write as a father. I buried my son, and I need to know his death wasn't in vain. Please don't forget the farmers who built this country. Don't forget us." By the time Jacob finished, Mary was weeping openly, and Sarah leaned against her father's arm. Even the Secret Service agents shifted uncomfortably, their faces softened by the moment. Trump cleared his throat, visibly moved. He folded the letter fully and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "I'll keep this," he said, "and I won't forget your son's name." For Jacob, it was more than a promise. It was recognition that Daniel's story mattered, that his boy's life, though cut short, had left a mark on the highest office in the land. Before leaving, Trump stood before the gathered crowd outside the farmhouse. Cameras rolled, capturing every word. Today, he began, "I didn't just visit a farm. I visited a family. I listened to a father's story, and I held the letter of a son who should still be here today. And I want everyone watching to understand. Farmers are not forgotten. They are the backbone of America." The crowd erupted in cheers, but Trump lifted his hand for silence. His tone grew heavier. I make this vow. Policies will change. We will work to ease the burden on families like the Millers. Because no father should bury his son for keeping food on America's table. Jacob stood nearby, tears streaming down his face, Mary's hand clutching his. Sarah leaned against her mother, eyes shining with pride. It was more than politics now. It was personal. For the first time, Jacob felt Daniel's story had broken through walls he once thought impenetrable. And deep inside he prayed, "May this moment plant a seed that grows far beyond my fields." The next day, Cedarfield felt transformed. Farmers who had long kept their struggles hidden now spoke openly. Neighbors who hadn't seen each other in years gathered at the Miller farm, sharing stories, sharing grief, and sharing hope. Jacob sat on the porch with Mary, watching trucks drive by, horns honking in solidarity. "It feels like Daniel's voice is alive again," Jacob whispered. Mary squeezed his hand. "Because you gave it life, Jacob." National news carried the story everywhere. Headlines read, "Farmer's plea moves Trump to tears." And "A son's story changes the conversation on farming." Letters poured in from families across the country. Some had lost loved ones to despair. Others simply wanted to say, "Thank you for speaking up." Sarah, once quiet and withdrawn, began helping her dad more on the farm. One evening, she said softly, "Dad, I think Daniel would be proud." Jacob hugged her tightly, fighting tears. Though challenges remained, something had shifted. Jacob no longer felt alone. The weight he carried had been lifted, if only slightly, by the realization that his son's story was now bigger than their grief. Weeks later, Jacob received a call from Washington. His story had sparked discussions at the highest levels. New initiatives were being drafted to support small farmers, mental health hotlines dedicated to rural communities, financial programs for struggling farms, and resources to prevent tragedies like Daniel's. Jacob could hardly believe it. "One voice. Just one voice, Mary," he said in awe. "It wasn't just one voice," Mary replied. "It was a father's love." Trump himself called Jacob. "I told you I wouldn't forget." He said, "This isn't a quick fix, but it's a start, and it's because of you." Jacob thanked him quietly, then said, "It's not about me. It's about every farmer who feels invisible. If Daniel's story saves even one life, then his death won't have been for nothing." After hanging up, Jacob sat in silence, tears on his cheeks. For the first time since burying his son, he felt peace. Daniel's absence was still a wound, but now it had become a seed of change, one that could grow across the nation. One morning, Jacob received a letter postmarked from Kansas. Inside was a handwritten note. "Dear Mr. Miller, I don't know you, but I saw your story on the news. I'm also a farmer. Last year, I nearly gave up on everything, but after hearing about your son, I realized I'm not alone. I asked for help instead of giving in. Your son saved my life. Thank you." Jacob read it aloud at the breakfast table. Mary covered her face, weeping softly, while Sarah whispered, "Daniel's still helping people." Word of more letters spread. Dozens arrived weekly from across the country. Farmers, veterans, single parents, all sharing how Daniel's story had given them strength. Jacob kept them in a wooden box, calling it Daniel's Harvest. Whenever he felt weary, he opened the box and reread the words, reminding himself that his son's short life continued to bear fruit. "Even in death, he's planting seeds," Jacob murmured. Sarah smiled, tears in her eyes. "Seeds that will never stop growing." One quiet Sunday, Jacob walked to the cemetery carrying a folded newspaper. Mary and Sarah followed close behind. At Daniel's grave, Jacob knelt down, brushing leaves off the stone. His voice was steady, but heavy with emotion. "Son, you wouldn't believe it if you saw it. The president came to our farm. He read your letter, and people all across the country know your name." He laid the newspaper on the grave, its headline showing a photo of Trump shaking his hand. "This is because of you, Daniel. Your struggle wasn't forgotten." Mary placed flowers beside the stone and whispered, "Your story is saving lives, sweetheart." Sarah leaned down, touching the cold granite. "I miss you, but I promise I'll keep the farm alive for you." The three of them stood there together, grief and pride intertwined. Jacob closed his eyes and prayed silently. For the first time in years, he didn't pray for strength to endure. He prayed in gratitude for the chance to turn tragedy into hope and for the lives his son was still touching. Months later, Jacob was invited to speak at a town hall event hosted by Trump. Nervous but resolute, he stepped onto the stage. "I'm not a politician," Jacob began, his voice echoing. "I'm just a farmer who lost his son. But I stand here because silence costs too much. Families are struggling, and too many lives have been lost in that silence." The crowd listened with rapt attention. Many were farmers, veterans, and families who knew that pain. Jacob held up Daniel's photo. "This is my boy. He didn't die because he was weak. He died because he carried too much with too little help. I tell his story so no other parent has to live with this." Applause thundered through the hall. Trump, sitting nearby, stood and clapped with the crowd. When Jacob stepped down, people lined up to shake his hand, hug him, or simply say, "Thank you." That night, as he returned home, Jacob whispered to Mary, "I think we're finally turning grief into something bigger than us." Mary squeezed his hand. Something eternal. The Miller farm slowly began to heal. Financial relief programs helped stabilize their land. Sarah enrolled in agricultural studies at a nearby college, determined to continue her family's legacy. One evening, she told her father, "I want to make farming better, not just for us, but for everyone." Daniel's story gave me purpose. Jacob's heart swelled with pride. "You'll carry his torch, Sarah." The farm, once heavy with sorrow, began to feel alive again. Neighbors gathered often, supporting one another, building a stronger community. Jacob noticed small changes, too. Farmers talking openly about their struggles, reaching out for help instead of hiding it. The silence was breaking. Sitting on his porch at sunset, Jacob